Hello, I'm Leslie Stewart, one of the violin teachers at Colorado State University. Today I'm going to discuss several ways in which you can prepare for this year's audition for the Colorado All-State Orchestras. In this video, I will talk briefly about preparing the required scales, as well as covering in more detail the orchestral excerpts. I will also discuss your choice of solo material and how to select pieces that can help you put your best foot forward in any audition. There are several items to always keep in mind when playing your scales. Use the entire bow for all scales. One trick for making sure that every 16th note is getting the same amount of bow is to put chalk marks on your bow like this. One in the middle, one on either side, so you have these quadrants. Since you are making an audio tape instead of a videotape, no one on the audition committee will see these marks except you and your school teacher. But it will ensure against you using too much bow for some notes and too little for others. Focus on smooth bow changes so that you can demonstrate your mastery of legato. Make sure that you are not stopping between down bows and up bows, and be careful that you are not accenting any bow changes. Make sure you have marked your fingerings so that your intonation is secure. You might want to start the E-flat scales in 4th position on the G string with the 2nd finger instead of starting them in 1st position. That will avoid a rather large shift from 1st to 4th position in the 3rd measure. I think this is particularly awkward in measure 13 when you are playing the faster version of this scale. Let me demonstrate both fingerings, starting with the 1st position, and then I'll show you what it looks like starting in the 4th position. Please note, it is perfectly fine to use the fingering printed in the music, which starts in 1st position. What's most important is that you use a fingering that you can trust. If you have a private teacher, they can give you other fingering suggestions. If not, keep experimenting until you find one that is most reliable for excellent intonation. Practice isolating your shifts, since these are the areas that are most prone to intonation issues. I highly recommend using the guide finger principle, which is simply to use the last finger in the old position to take you to the new position. This principle works with any finger and can help you with shifts going up and down the fingerboard. As you may know, the first descending shift is often the most vulnerable to intonation problems, so you might want to spend extra time with this particular shift. Make sure that your entire hand is shifting, and notice your left hand shape as well as your left arm position. Pay particular attention to your left thumb, since it is really our thumb that needs to negotiate the shift, rather than focusing on the fingers. Use your metronome most of the time to help you internalize the tempo. You will not be able to use it when you're making your audition tape, of course, so you will need to get used to playing without the metronome and then checking it right away to make sure your tempo is accurate and steady. Although we do not usually use vibrato on scales, I suggest you consider using it on the quarter note version so that you can demonstrate your skill with this technique to the audition committee. However, I do not recommend using vibrato if doing so will compromise your intonation. And certainly, if your school teacher or private teacher recommends that you play without vibrato, you should follow their recommendation. The audition committee does not give extra points for vibrato, nor do they reduce points if you play without it. What they do want to hear is beautiful tone, excellent intonation, clean shifts, and a steady pulse. And now on to the excerpts. I believe that the first step in preparing any orchestral audition is to listen to one or more recordings of the required excerpts while looking at the entire score. I encourage you to get a copy of both the Mozart and Brahms scores so that you have a full idea of the context of each of these excerpts. The website imslp.org allows you to download a movement or an entire work of any music that is no longer protected by copyright. The works of these composers are now in public domain, so you will have no problem getting access to these scores. Next, listen to a CD or watch a video recording of both pieces while looking at the full score. Then do it again, looking at the first violin excerpt. You cannot do this too many times. The more you are familiar with what is going on in the rest of the orchestra, the easier it will be for you to hear the entire orchestra in your head while making your tape. If you do this, you will find it impossible to learn wrong pitches or rhythms. This year's excerpts also give you a chance to demonstrate the difference between the classical style for the Mozart and a big romantic sound for the Brahms. Music written in the classical period should be above all elegant and light. So remember that a forte in Mozart will be very different than a forte in Brahms. Please note that the tempo indications for both excerpts are your goal tempos, not the tempo you should start with on your metronome. In other words, start slow and work your way up with each excerpt gradually using your metronome. I like to write down the metronome marking and the date I've achieved it so that I know where to start the next day. Doing this will help you realize how far you've progressed and keep you on track to reach the goal tempo. There are so many issues to address in learning any new piece that this might be a good time to discuss the order in which you could tackle each one. I always start with rhythm, and if it is complex, I learn this away from the instrument so that I'm not distracted by what I'm doing with both hands. Rhythm, of course, is not a major issue for the Mozart excerpt, but it is for the Brahms, so we will discuss this later. Next, I focus on pitch and intonation. This means practicing everything slowly with separate bows, then gradually speeding it up, still with separate bows, so that the left hand is trained to play in tune, including shifts. Then I go back to the original slow tempo and add in slurs. Once I can play the marked bowing, I need to think about where I should be in the bow and how much bow I should use. There are several issues to be considered, including the musical period in which the piece was written, as well as dynamics, articulation, and tempo. In the case of this Mozart excerpt, I believe that all of it should be played in the middle of the bow. If you are used to playing most of the time above the middle of the bow, you will not be able to play a real spiccato. If you are used to playing most of the time in the lower part of the bow, it will be too heavy and really unwieldy for the string crossings. First, I'll demonstrate playing too high in the bow. Next, I'll demonstrate by playing too low on the bow. Finally, I'll demonstrate the ideal, which is playing in the middle of the bow. The string crossings, of course, present the most challenge in this excerpt. I find it helpful to isolate string crossings by practicing the right arm movements on open strings first. This develops muscle memory in the right arm. Finally, you can then add in the left hand, starting slowly and then speeding this passage up. Some of you may prefer to move into second position on the fourth note of measure 15. This would reduce the string crossings that you have to do through measure 17. Then I would recommend going back to first position at the beginning of measure 18. The same strategy would apply to measures 22, starting in second position for 2 measures, and then returning to first position in measure 24. Now, many of you may be wondering how much of this excerpt needs to be played spiccato. Again, I think you should ask your private teacher or school teacher for their advice. You may notice that by the time you get this excerpt up to the target tempo, the bow almost comes off the string by itself. However, if you think you will get a better sound and have more bow control by keeping it on the string, I would suggest that you play very tiny bows on the string for most of this excerpt. In this case, you would only play the 8th notes in measures 1 and 7 off the string. Finally, I would like to suggest an alternative bowing to the one indicated on the first 2 lines. Instead of taking this as it comes, you might want to play 2 up bows on the 8th note at the end of the first measure. This will give you a sense of landing on the dotted quarter notes at the beginning of measure 2 and 4. However, if you make this choice, remember that there is really no time to do a retake on the 2 down bows at the beginning of measure 4. Instead, I recommend saving your bow on the first note, stopping exactly on the dot of the dotted quarter, and continuing to do another down bow without lifting it off the string. This would also go for measures 9 through 12. I will demonstrate this under tempo, so you can mark these bowings in your part if you like. Now let's look at the Brahms. As I mentioned earlier, the first step of learning any piece after listening to it is to focus on the rhythm. When you hear a recording of this piece, you will notice immediately that the timpani pounds out 8th notes for the first several bars of this symphony. If you can remember what that sounds like every time you practice this excerpt, it can provide a steady metronome in your head that will keep you from playing notes too short. For now, let's use a real metronome and practice the rhythm away from the violin. Sometimes we can do this with clapping, but with something of this complexity, it is probably better to vocalize it. Notice I didn't say sing it because we're not going to be thinking about pitch, not yet, just rhythm. So we will taw the rhythm with the metronome set on 8th notes. ta, 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 ta. If you have already been working with the metronome, you may have noticed that I set mine at a somewhat slower tempo than what is indicated on the printed excerpt, which is eighth note equals 104. In listening to numerous recordings, you will find that every conductor has a somewhat different idea about what is the so-called right tempo for this piece. The audition committee will accept whatever tempo you play as long as it is within a reasonable range. Let's say eighth note equals 76 up to 104. My personal preference is eighth note equals 88 or slower, because I think that lends itself to the weight and the somberness of this opening. What matters much more than whatever speed you choose is that the tempo remains constant for the entire excerpt. The next step would be to focus on pitch, which I believe is best done with separate bows. This way you can focus your entire attention on your left hand first. Fingerings are, of course, a very personal matter, and there are many factors that affect the choices that you make. For example, the size of your hand, the length of your fingers may dictate whether you can negotiate large shifts or whether it is best for you to do smaller shifts and shift more often. Your private teacher will be your best guide, but if you are looking for some other ideas, here's the fingering that I use. Please feel free to pause the video now and copy mine into your part. You will probably find that the most difficult shifts are in measures 5 and 6. Again, I suggest using the guide finger principle, which I will now demonstrate. You may also find it helpful to set up each octave with the first and fourth fingers following each tied note. Here's a demonstration. You will notice that I start measure 11 on the D string instead of starting this passage on the A string. The reason is because I'm trying to achieve a particular tone color. I'll demonstrate. First, I will play this passage on the A string, then I'll play the same passage starting on the D string. Listen to the color change. I also play the pickup to measure 19 on the A string instead of on the E string for the same reason. I believe that these fingering choices give these passages a darker tone color which enhances the mood of this section. However, once again, you should choose fingerings that work best for you, both technically and artistically. Now let's add the bowings. The printed excerpt did not include any, of course, which gives you the freedom to do whatever you and your teacher choose. Here are mine. I think this excerpt is a great etude in bow usage. If you focus on controlling the speed of the bow in the first and last sections using all of the bow, you can achieve the power that I think this piece requires from each member of the violin section. At letter A, I suggest you stay near the tip of the bow for the first two measures and then gradually increase the amount of bow for the long crescendo to the end. It is also important to notice the swells on the long notes from measure 11 to letter A. Finally, you may have noticed that I added a diminuendo to measure 7. This is commonly done because otherwise it is not really possible to do a crescendo in the 9/8 measure. I have also added an extra F to the forte on the downbeat of measure 9 so that the crescendo can be more dramatic. The final part of your tape will be a solo piece of your choice. Sometimes it's tempting to record a more challenging piece because you've just started working on it, or you think it will be more impressive than an easier piece you performed a few months ago. I urge you to choose your solo wisely. The committee will be more impressed by a solid performance of a less difficult piece than a flawed rendering of something that is more challenging. Make sure that the solo shows what you can do, not what you have not yet mastered. Preparing your audition tape will make you a better player, even if it turns out that you are not accepted this year. I believe it is a worthwhile endeavor, no matter what the outcome. Good luck.